She walked into a room built to humiliate her. No throne, no chair, only a mat on the floor, the place reserved for those who came to beg. She looked at the Portuguese governor, turned to one of her attendants, and had him kneel on all fours. Then she sat upon his back as if it were a throne, and met the eyes of an empire that expected her to grovel. She did not grovel. That single act, recorded by witnesses in the year 1622, would become the opening chapter of one of the longest wars of resistance in African history, a war led not by a king, but a woman named Nzinga. This is not legend. This is not folklore softened for children's books. This is a documented historical account of a ruler who fought European colonization for nearly 30 decades, outlived multiple governors sent to destroy her, and died an old woman on her own throne in her own kingdom, never having signed away her people's freedom. By the end of this film, you will understand why Portuguese military records described her as more dangerous than any king they had faced in Africa. If forgotten history matters to you, subscribe now, because this channel exists to bring stories like hers out of the archive and back into the light. Stay until the end, because the final years of her life reveal something even more remarkable than the war itself. The story begins in West Central Africa, in the early 1580s, in the Kingdom of Ndongo, a region that today lies within modern Angola. Ndongo was ruled by a monarch known as the Ngola, a title from which the Portuguese would eventually derive the very name Angola. Nzinga was born into this royal family, the daughter of King Kilwanji, at a moment when the Portuguese Empire was already tightening its grip along the Atlantic coast. Lisbon's interest in the region was not exploration, it was extraction. First gold and ivory, and increasingly human beings. The transatlantic slave trade was accelerating, and Ndongo sat directly in its path. From childhood, Nzinga was raised differently than most princesses of her era. Historical accounts describe her father training her personally in the use of weapons, in the strategy of warfare, and in the politics of a kingdom under siege. She was permitted to observe councils of war. She learned the languages and customs of the Portuguese, knowledge that would later become one of her sharpest weapons. Her brother, Mbondi, was the heir to the throne, but it was Nzinga who was being shaped, deliberately or not, into a leader capable of surviving what was coming. By the time Nzinga reached adulthood, Ndongo was hemorrhaging. Portuguese forces, based in the coastal fortress of Luanda, were pushing inland, arming rival African factions and destabilizing the kingdom through a strategy of divide and conquer. Villages were raided for captives bound for the slave ships. Ndongo's population was being drained not only by war, but by an economy of human trafficking that had turned neighbor against neighbor. In 1622, with the kingdom weakened and her brother Mbondi struggling to hold power, Nzinga was sent as an ambassador to Luanda to negotiate directly with the Portuguese governor, João Correia de Sousa. It was a mission that required more than diplomacy. It required theater, intelligence, and nerve, because the Portuguese had a long-standing habit of using seating arrangements as psychological warfare. African emissaries were given no chair. They were made to sit or kneel on mats on the floor, beneath the governor seated above them in a chair of authority. It was a small detail with an enormous message. You are beneath us before we have even spoken. Nzinga refused to accept the message. According to the historical record, upon entering the chamber and finding no seat prepared for her, she instructed one of her own attendants to get down on the floor, and she sat upon his back, facing the governor at eye level. She then proceeded to negotiate as an equal, discussing terms of peace, trade, and the return of Ndongo captives, without ever lowering herself to the position the Portuguese had designed for her. It was not simply an act of pride, it was a calculated demonstration that she understood the rules of the room and refused to let those rules define her. The negotiation that followed secured a temporary peace and an agreement that Portugal would recognize Ndongo's sovereignty and cease certain raiding operations. To seal the alliance, Nzinga accepted baptism into the Catholic Church, taking the name Dona Ana de Sousa, a strategic move as much as a spiritual one, intended to bind the Portuguese to their word through the language of their own faith. It would not be the last time she used their own institutions as leverage against them.
But peace did not last. Her brother Mbandi died not long after, in 1624, under circumstances that remain disputed among historians. Some accounts suggest suicide, others suggest foul play. What is certain is that Mzinga moved swiftly to claim power, positioning herself first as regent for her young nephew, and then as queen in her own right. Her rise was contested. Rival factions questioned whether a woman could legitimately hold the throne of Ndongo, and some accused her of eliminating rivals to secure it. The Portuguese, sensing division, refused to recognize her as queen at all, preferring to negotiate instead with rulers they believed easier to control. Rejected by the very colonial power she had once negotiated with as an equal, Mzinga made a decision that would define the next 3 decades of her life. She would not beg for the crown to be recognized. She would take a kingdom, build an army, and force recognition through war. She relocated her base of power to the neighboring kingdom of Matamba, a region less exposed to Portuguese military reach, and began assembling one of the most formidable resistance forces Central Africa had seen. She forged an alliance with the Mbangala, a highly mobile warrior society feared for their brutal effectiveness in battle. Some historical sources suggest Mzinga herself trained and led certain military units directly, and multiple accounts describe her adopting a title used by Mbangala war leaders, signaling that she intended to be recognized not merely as a queen, but as a commander of war.
What followed was not a single battle, but a prolonged campaign of guerrilla warfare that would stretch across nearly 30 years. Nzinga's forces avoided direct, fixed confrontations with the better-armed Portuguese military whenever possible. Instead, they relied on speed, terrain, and unpredictability, striking supply lines, freeing captives being marched toward the coast for enslavement, and retreating before Portuguese forces could organize a counterattack. Matamba's shifting capital, moved strategically to avoid capture, became a symbol of a kingdom that could not be pinned down. In 1641, the geopolitical landscape shifted in Nzinga's favor. The Dutch, locked in their own colonial rivalry with Portugal, seized the port of Luanda. Nzinga, recognizing an opportunity, formed a military alliance with the Dutch against their shared Portuguese enemy. For a brief window, African resistance and European colonial rivalry aligned, and Nzinga's forces, reinforced by Dutch weapons and soldiers, pushed back Portuguese positions with a level of success that alarmed Lisbon. This period also reveals one of the most striking aspects of Nzinga's rule, her integration of women into military and political life at a level virtually unheard of in the region at the time. Historical accounts describe women serving in her army and holding positions of authority within her court, a structural choice that reflected her own path to power and reinforced her legitimacy as a ruler who did not simply occupy a throne built for men, but redefined who could hold power at all. The war years were not without devastating setbacks. In 1646, Portuguese forces captured Nzinga's sister, Mukambu, along with several members of her inner circle during a military campaign against Matamba's forces. The following year brought a temporary reversal in fortune when combined Dutch and Congo forces helped Nzinga inflict a major defeat on the Portuguese. But by 1648, the tide turned again. A Portuguese fleet arrived from Brazil, recaptured Luanda from the Dutch, and forced Nzinga's alliance to collapse. She retreated once more to Matamba, regrouped, and continued the war largely alone. For years afterward, Portuguese governors attempted repeatedly to negotiate a definitive peace, each attempt complicated by the fact that Nzinga refused to accept terms that treated Matamba as a subordinate vassal state. She wanted formal recognition as a sovereign monarch, equal in standing, not a conquered chief granted mercy. Multiple Portuguese officials, in their own reports back to Lisbon, expressed frustration and something close to reluctant respect, describing a ruler who could not be worn down through military pressure alone. It was not until 1656, when Nzinga was already in her 70s, that a peace treaty was finally signed between Matamba and Portugal, and critically, it was signed on terms that recognized her sovereignty rather than dismantling it. This was not a surrender. It was the closing of a war that neither side had been able to win outright, concluded by a monarch who had spent 34 years making certain that any peace would be negotiated at eye level, not from the floor.
In her final years, Nzinga turned her attention to rebuilding a kingdom scarred by decades of warfare. She worked to resettle former soldiers, revive agricultural production, and restore trade routes disrupted by war. Some accounts describe her attempting to reduce Matamba's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade during this period, seeking to end her kingdom's dependence on an economy built on human suffering, even as neighboring regions remained deeply entangled in it. She continued practicing the Catholic faith she had adopted decades earlier, blending it alongside traditional customs, and worked to secure a stable line of succession, determined that the sovereignty she had fought to preserve would not collapse the moment she was gone. Nzinga died in December of 1663, in her 80s, having ruled Matamba as an independent monarch until her final breath. She was buried in the leopard skins traditionally reserved for warriors and rulers of her status, a final, unmistakable statement about how she intended to be remembered, not as a diplomat who made peace with an empire, but as a monarch who forced that empire to treat her as its equal. Within a generation of her death, Portugal moved more aggressively to reassert control over the region, and Matamba's independence gradually eroded under renewed colonial pressure. But the war itself, and the woman who led it, could not be erased from the historical record. Portuguese chroniclers of the era, even those writing from within a colonial system that had every incentive to diminish African resistance, documented her military campaigns, her diplomatic maneuvers, and her refusal to accept subjugation in terms that revealed genuine alarm at what she had accomplished. Today, Nzinga is remembered across Angola and much of the African diaspora as one of the earliest and most sustained symbols of resistance to European colonization on the continent. Statues have been raised in her honor in Luanda, the very city where she once refused to kneel on a mat before a governor's chair. Streets, schools, and cultural institutions carry her name. She is frequently placed alongside other African leaders who resisted colonial conquest, figures whose stories, like hers, were pushed to the margins of history books written from the perspective of the empires that eventually won more territory, even when they never fully won the argument.
What makes Nzinga's story exceptional is not simply that she resisted colonization. Many African rulers attempted that, in ways large and small across the continent. What makes her exceptional is the duration, the strategic sophistication, and the sheer persistence of that resistance. She did not fight for a single battle or a single season. She fought, planned, retreated, allied, betrayed, and rebuilt for 34 years, from her 40s into her 80s, adapting her strategy to a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape that included not just Portugal, but Dutch colonial ambitions and the shifting loyalties of neighboring African kingdoms. The chair, in the end, was never really about furniture. It was about the terms on which power would be recognized. Empires have long relied on small rituals of humiliation to establish dominance before a single word of negotiation is spoken. A lower seat, a lower gaze, a lower status assumed before it is ever earned. Nzinga's genius was recognizing that ritual for exactly what it was, and refusing to let her body confirm a hierarchy her mind had already rejected. She built her throne out of a servant's back in a single afternoon in 1622. She spent the next 4 decades making sure the rest of the world understood that image was not a performance. It was a preview. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel, because there are dozens of rulers like Nzinga whose names have been buried under centuries of colonial record-keeping, waiting to be told properly. Leave a comment with the name of another king or queen history tried to erase. Your suggestions shape which story we tell next. Share this video with someone who believes history is only written by the victors, because Nzinga's story is proof that sometimes the ones who refuse to kneel get remembered longest of all. They built a room designed to make her small. She left it having redefined what power was allowed to look like. That is the story of Queen Nzinga, the African queen who refused to kneel.